Hi viewers, in this video I will show you how I removed and installed the front strut assemblies on my Jeep Patriot 2009. I will also show you how I compressed the coil spring in order to rebuild the strut assemblies.
To make sure I had all the required parts to complete the job, I took the time to inspect the strut assemblies and the other parts attached to them. The inspection was easy and it was obvious that some fluid was leaking from the struts. The dust shields were also damaged and had to be replaced. I had the required tools to rebuild and install the front strut assemblies, so I bought only 2 new front struts and 2 dust shields. When I was back in my garage, I lifted the front of the vehicle and I secured the working area with jack stands, ramps, and wheel chocks. For safety, the key was removed, the transmission shifter was in park position, and the handbrake was engaged. To make the video easier to watch, I will only show the strut assembly replacement that was filmed on the right-hand side of the Jeep Patriot. Since it was easy to reach the parts when the front wheels were removed, I sprayed penetrating fluid on all the bolts and nuts that had to be unscrewed to remove the strut assemblies. The first component that I disconnected was the sway bar link kit attached on the strut. For this, I used the 15mm wrench and a 5mm Allen key socket. Only the nut was unscrewed, while the stud was kept stationary. Note that the sway bar was in low position, so it made the link kit attachment easy to disconnect. The next step was to disconnect the brake hose bracket. I used 2 types of 13mm wrenches. The bracket was also used to hold the speed sensor harness. After, when the nuts connecting the struts and the knuckle together were accessible, I held the 2 bolts in place and I unscrewed the 2 nuts with a 21mm socket. The 2 bolts were tight fit in the knuckle and I had to extract them with a hammer and a pin punch. To ease the job, I kept the 2 pin punches in place during the next step. To unscrew the upper mount nuts, I used the 15mm socket. I also kept 2 nuts loosely screwed on the studs to temporarily hold the upper mount in place. Then, when the strut assembly was loose enough, I removed the 2 pin punches. With one hand I held the assembly and, with the other hand, I unscrewed the remaining nuts holding the upper mount in place. Whenever I have to compress the coil springs, I always get my small bench ready and the new parts nearby. There are many ways to hold the struts, but I simply use the piece of wood with 2 holes and 2 bolts as shown. Usually, low-cost spring compressors are sold in pair, but I use a third compressor from a second kit to make a trio to improve the safety and the efficiency. To compress the coil springs evenly, I only screwed the compressor bolts one after the other until there was no load applied on the upper mount. At this moment I was able to move the coil spring on the spring seat and the play was fine. Only then the nut holding the strut rod was ready to be unscrewed. Since the strut had to be replaced, there was no restriction from using locking pliers to hold the strut rod stationary. In this case, I used an 18mm socket to unscrew the nut. Note, if an original Jeep strut is removed and or reinstalled, the strut tools 9362 and 9894 should be used to avoid using locking pliers on the rod. Personally, I found those tools too expensive to buy, so I used my own customized sockets. When the nut was unscrewed, I slowly disassembled the components and I paid attention on how the assembly was made. Because the upper spring seat was firmly anchored on the coil spring, I kept it in place. The old dust shield was removed and it was put in the garbage bin due to poor condition. To avoid mixing up the right strut and the left strut during the job, I compared the parts and I marked the right one with a red tape. A new strut is always sold with the rod in lockdown position. With this model, I only had to rotate the rod counterclockwise to unlock it. To make sure the rod was kept clean during the reassembly, I installed the dust shield first. After, it was safe to install the rubber isolator in place. As shown, I inserted the rubber guides properly for a good fit. Once done, I seated the coil spring in place. I carefully adjusted the lower part of the coil spring on the isolator. Since the upper spring seat and the upper mount were rusted, I brushed them a little bit and I applied brake lubricant near the bearing location to slow down the rusting process and repel the water. The flat bearing was also covered with brake lubricant to protect it from water and dirt. Later, I positioned the bearing and the upper mount. I centered the parts together and I checked if the bearing was moving properly. I installed by hand the new nut provided with the new strut. To complete this step, I used my modified socket that fitted with the new aftermarket strut. To protect the bearing, it is not recommended to spin the strut rod with any high-speed tool. As shown, the rod can also be kept stationary. The nut was secured when the final torque was set to 44 foot-pounds. Before expanding the coil spring, I checked if the upper spring seat was well adjusted. The spring compressors were slowly extended as shown until they were loosened enough to be removed. I checked again the coil spring positioning on the upper and lower seatings before installing it on the Jeep. To position the assembly in its location, one hand was used to put the strut in place and the other hand was used to screw the nuts on the upper mount studs. After, when the studs were partially fastened, the upper section of the knuckle was inserted in between the lower strut brackets. I wasted no time and I inserted the pin punches in the holes to hold the knuckle in place. Then, when the basic positioning was done, it was time to finalize the upper mount installation. As required, the torque for the 3 nuts was set to 35 foot-pounds. The following step was to remove the pin punches and insert the bolts. Even if the parts were well aligned, I had to wiggle and push them to insert the bolts. Finally, to be fully inserted, the bolts had to be hammered into. Note, when the nuts are installed, only the nuts should be screwed. The torque for the 2 nuts was set to 62 foot-pounds. The sway bar was well positioned, so the linked ball stud was easy to insert in the strut bracket. To install the nut, I simply pressed the stud from behind and I screwed the nut with my other hand. Because the stud was firmly inserted in the bracket and it was not turning, I simply completed the step with my wrench without using an Allen key to hold it in place. The final torque was set to 43 foot-pounds. I finished the strut installation with the hose bracket and I checked the integrity of the speed sensor wires. Before installing the wheels, I checked the overall installation to make sure everything was fine. Later, when the strut assemblies were replaced on the right side and the left side, I installed the front wheels. Finally, when the vehicle was on the floor, even if it was not required, I took the time to check the front wheel toe-in alignment. I checked it with my custom alignment kit, and the toe-in was within the company specifications.
It's always good to check the price of the parts that we have to replace because it could be more profitable to buy a new assembly instead of rebuilding an old one.